Hello everybody. So welcome to the National Football Museum. So excited to see so many faces, some familiar faces here as well. Just wanted to give a really quick introduction to a friend of the museum, Gary James, who's here on behalf of these Trafford projects for the Women's Euros this summer. So the first part of this is going to be about the history of women's football in Manchester, and we've got a really exciting panel lined up for the second half. Start probably about 3 o'clock, the second half will start. So I'll have a quick break in between the two. But without further ado, come with a round of applause, please, for Dr. Gary James.
Thanks, and thanks for coming today in rainy Manchester. Always great. I'm Gary James, as has just been said, and I'm currently working on a heritage project for the Women's Euros. Each host city or borough, in Trafford's case, has a localised element to the project, and I've been working on the Trafford element. I'm sure most of you know, but for those who don't, Trafford is a metropolitan borough next to the city of Manchester. So I've put this map up just to explain for anyone who doesn't quite realise that Manchester's a city that, people often talk about the general conurbation as Manchester, and I know I will at times today, I will say Manchester when I mean different elements of the conurbation. But basically Trafford is on the left. Famously, Old Trafford is in that borough, but also towns such as Altrincham, Stretford, Urmston, and so on. So Trafford has been known for its football activities for well over a century. But to be fair, it's often been considered as part of Manchester, even though it is a separate borough. So because of this, the history of Trafford, football in Trafford, has not been analysed to the level that I'd like. And it's fair to say that when it comes to women's football, the mentions of Trafford-based games have tended to talk of games at Old Trafford or maybe one or two other games at various venues in the borough. And sometimes, or more often than not, they're usually reported as Manchester. So today I wanted to show the map to highlight the two neighbouring boroughs, and really wanted to talk a little bit about the project before we kick into the nitty-gritty. So what has the Trafford element of the Women's Euros project achieved so far? Well, we've managed to pull together our first history of women's football in Trafford. It's a starting point. I mean, to be frank, it's just the sort of beginning, if you like. And in actual fact, it's the first history of any form of football in Trafford. People who talk about Trafford will talk about the great teams that are from Trafford, obviously Manchester United, Altrincham and so on. But in terms of the borough, it's not really discussed. We've performed interviews with women who played games in Trafford or women from Trafford who played for other teams. There's an exhibition at our local archive in Sale, which includes a 1958 Manchester Corinthians shirt. So if you get a chance to go to Sale, it's not a massive exhibition, it's not the National Football Museum, but it's got some nice, interesting items, some of which have been loaned from the Football Museum. We've got a website which, everyone should look at because we've got some stories on there too. So today, I'm going to talk about the history of women's football with particular emphasis on Trafford, but also on Manchester. So, first half is going to be a basic run through of the history of women's football, focusing on Trafford and Manchester. And then in the second half, we've got Jan Lyons, Leslie Wright and Jane Morley, who represent, I suppose, the three most famous women's teams from Manchester. I say the three most famous because, as you'll see, they're not the only ones, but people often think they are. So, at the end, there'll also be an opportunity for some questions. We might have to go into Fergie time for that, but we'll see what we can do. So, let's get right back to the beginning. Last December, the centenary of the FA ban on women's football, which I'll talk more about in a moment, led to various people talking of 100 years of women's football. The truth is that there's actually at least 140 years of organised football, certainly in the Manchester area, never mind anywhere else, and women have been playing football forever, as long as men. Don't think men were playing football and then women started kicking a ball. If you were walking the streets of Manchester in the 1860s and there was a football, it didn't matter if you were a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, you'd kick it. Probably out a window, but you'd kick it. I found references to girls playing football on the streets in old newspapers from that sort of period, as well as mention of boys and sometimes mention of children. So for me, if it mentions boys, it's boys. If it mentions children, it could be either. If it mentions girls, then it's clearly girls. In 1881, there's the earliest recorded attempt at an organised game locally. Now, It's often claimed that this was in Manchester, Tetlow Fold. Again, thinking about borders, it's actually in Salford, but it's the Manchester conurbation. But that game at Tetlow Fold was actually abandoned. They had 2 attempts at playing the game. It was abandoned. Depends what newspaper you read to see why it was abandoned. Some people claim it's because there were people sort of protesting against the game, that women shouldn't be playing football. Some people claim there's so many people excited about seeing the game that, there's pitch invasion and so on. Whatever it was, it doesn't really matter today. What does matter is that there were attempts to organise a game of football. It was part of a standard tour. And then in the 1890s, the British ladies did another tour. 1895, there were games in Trafford, certainly. And the game in Trafford in 1895 was a North v South. The British Ladies Football Club was one general club, and they did like exhibition games playing different elements of the same club. So North v South, maybe England v Scotland, maybe, whatever. But it was North v South in Trafford. And their 1895 game in Stretford at the West Manchester Football Ground was the earliest known women's game in Trafford. I always say earliest known because I'm hoping that in a few months' time I'll find another one that was 10 years earlier. But at the moment, earliest known. It was criticised by some who said that, women shouldn't be playing football. But obviously, most of the reports that were written about this were written by men. Possibly all of the reports. And they may have had their own preconceived ideas. Just want to focus on that date a bit. 1895. So to put that into men's football perspective, in 1894, Manchester City was created as Manchester City. 1902, Manchester United was created as Manchester United. We were playing as Newton Heath before that. And in 1910, Manchester United moved to Old Trafford. So this game at the West Manchester Ground is before all of that, 15 years before Manchester United played in Trafford. So after that point, and before World War I, women's football did happen. Women did play football, but it wasn't generally reported. And this is a bit of an issue for us because we want to find evidence. So typically, it would be reported if there was some kind of newsworthy item. So in this report that you can see on the screen, Frightening a Lady Footballer, Helen Matthews, who was involved, or a key figure behind the British ladies' football tours of the 1890s and at other times, got into trouble because basically there's an accusation that a football shirt had been stolen. None of that's relevant to what I'm trying to say, really, apart from this is the only way we know that there's a game of football scheduled between Manchester and Liverpool. There's no match report yet that we found. There may be in some reports, in some newspapers somewhere that we've not got into, but this is an example that it only made the news because of this other event where there's this problem over his shirt and so on. So I think that's a major clue that there's more activity going on than we generally know of. But the first big development in women's football, I guess, is World War I. And I'm sure most of you know something about this from the last couple of years and some of the publicity that there's been. But women's football was developing mostly, at a rapid pace during World War I. And what tended to happen was that, as with other industrial centres, women's team became established at factories, munition works, both in Manchester and in Trafford, particularly in Trafford Park, large industrial park. There's also a Manchester League that was developed. We don't know too much about that, again, because of the types of reports that we've got. But what we do know is that Manchester League applied for direct affiliation to the FA. And the men who ran the FA at the time were like, oh my God, women are trying to join the FA. What are we going to do? Let's talk about it after the war. And they delayed it, so they didn't have to discuss it. I want to get over a point, really, that I think is pretty significant. But people often say the men were away fighting, the women played football because there was a void. Well, yeah, men were away fighting. Some women were away, obviously. But almost without exception, every professional men's football team in England continued to play. Regional leagues were developed. So every week there was a game at either Old Trafford or at Hyde Road. Old Trafford or at Hyde Road, at City or United. So those games were taking place. So the women didn't play because there was this void. The women played because they're working together in factories, and naturally, they kick a football around, the camaraderie, they create teams, and they develop. So women played football because women wanted to, not because men were missing. I want to show you this picture. This is actually from the National Football Museum archive. This is a typical factory team from Trafford, British Westinghouse. They became quite famous. They played in front of some decent crowds across the north of England. I just love this picture. Look at the kit. So those caps are blue. The shirts, the jerseys are white. And then the skirts, I think, are blue because I think they match the caps. But just those women are playing football because they want to, not because some blokes gone off to war. They're playing because they want to. And they represented women's football really well. I'd love to find out about every single one of them and what they did and so on, but unfortunately we're only at the beginning of some of this. After World War I, the game grew quite still at a fast rate, really, which also demonstrates this fact that the men came back from fighting, and yet women's football was still growing. So if it was a void, that's total rubbish, really. Games were staged at various grounds in the region. Many of these were charity matches. That table is just an indication. I know you probably can't read it anyway, but it's just an indication of some of the games that were being played here. There were others. There were prominent games involving the famous team of the sort of period, Dick Kerr ladies, who were an incredible team, but also prominent games involving British Westinghouse, who we've just seen, Manchester ladies. Some people, and myself included, believe that British Westinghouse and Manchester ladies were the same team. There's something I'm going to show in a little while which suggests there may be a different Manchester ladies at this time, but anyway, we can talk about that in a moment. Now, back in December, I did a talk in Hebden Bridge in West Yorkshire, and for that I'd identified that the town had discussions about creating its own women's football team. This wasn't a major men's club trying to create a women's team. This wasn't a major venue trying to stage a game. This was basically a typical, what we call now non-league men's team, having a discussion about creating a women's team. So for me, this shows that it penetrated that far. The big games will get the attention, but there are opportunities at a different level for women to play football that we only know because they appear in occasional reports in local papers. What we don't know is how many regional newspapers survived, how many games were covered. We don't know any of that. So we'll see. I've only put this up just as another indication. Stadebridge Celtic, which we know is just down the road in Tameside, they staged the Dick Kerr's Ladies game, which basically is the record crowd for a ground. It's around about 12,000, I think, off the top of my head. It's never officially recorded as a record crowd. Why? Well, I made the point a couple of years ago in another talk about that, and then I noticed that somebody's updated the Wikipedia page to talk about the women's game getting a bigger crowd, but I'm not certain if the official Stadebridge Celtic records have been changed yet. But just gives an indication that there's so much that got lost or didn't get reported in the way that we would do today. So, after World War I, women's football continued to grow. People often talk about the game at Goodison Park for Dick Kerr's that attracted 53,000 or so. There's debates about the actual crowd, but let's go with 53,000 for today. But this wasn't a one-off. There were lots of significant crowds. So the 35,000, which sometimes is reported as 31,000, was over 5,000 higher than Manchester United's average attendance for men for the previous season. The 33,000 at Bolton was higher than the Bolton Wanderers' average attendance. So yes, these are one-off games, but it sort of shows the scale of these. And most of these are sort of charity events and perhaps got a lot of publicity behind them. But also, it wasn't just Dick Kerr's. Dick Kerr's were by far the biggest and by far the most famous. But for other teams like Huddersfield, Atalanta, I mentioned there, who got 15,000 for their first game in Huddersfield. And there's other teams, Aysbury, and I could go through a full list. Sadly, we haven't got time today. But what I'm trying to say is that there were several prominent clubs in that period up to 1921. So why did they get big crowds? Well, people wanted to watch. Sometimes it was because there's a charity element. Sometimes there may have been a local celebrity involved. Sometimes people were curious. But the fact is, people were going to watch it. Now, if something's a novelty, you might watch it once. You know, I watched Coronation Street, didn't like it, not going to watch it again. If you watch Coronation Street week after week after week, you like it, you enjoy it, or you're intrigued as what happens next. Local clubs were developing. So Manchester ladies, that I mentioned before about British Westinghouse. So, need to move on to the next page. So this is in a regional newspaper that's not been digitised. It's falling apart. It might not survive much longer, but this is an invitation for people to join Manchester ladies. The assistant secretary, and I love that, it's an assistant secretary, so there's a structure, right? Miss White lives in Fallowfield, which sort of goes against the idea of this being British Westinghouse. This suggests this is another team, because Fallowfield, yes, she could have travelled, but Fallowfield's not in that sort of area. Much more research to be done on that, but that sort of shows that's a regional newspaper that's not been digitised, that people have forgotten about, that's tucked away, and yet there's a letter there that I had never seen before until a few months back. Some famous footballers became involved, such as, every time I talk, I have to mention Billy Meredith. So, Billy Meredith. The first great Manchester-based footballer. He's Welsh, but first great. And he got involved. So if men were against women playing, or professional footballers were against women playing, what's Meredith doing there? Now, he may have been after some money, who knows, because that's another side of Meredith's life, which I won't get into today, but anyway. So what came next? And this is the sad part. So those who were here for Carrie Dunn's talk earlier will have heard her talk about the ban, the FA ban, and she's absolutely right in saying the FA ban was not a ban on women playing football. It was a ban on women playing football on FA-affiliated grounds, which is almost, you know, excluding park pitches and rugby grounds, it's a lot of FA grounds. You know, Hyde United, that's an FA ground. You know, lots of what we would see as non-league grounds are FA-affiliated grounds. And then the other one, which is the crucial one for me as well, is that women's football was banned. But if you were a coach of a men's team or involved with a professional men's team, you were banned from working with a women's team or promoting women's football. I'll talk about that in a moment, but that's crucial for me. The reasons given was unsuitable for women and financial mismanagement. Well, these financial mismanagement could have been sorted. There's financial mismanagement in the men's game. You know, again, if you've done any research on men's football, you'll know about turnstiles that were not counted and all sorts of things like that. So, this bottom line, I always want to talk about this as well. To think of the damage to women's football, think about if men's football had been banned in 1921. No Nat Lofthouse, no Matt Busby, no Bert Troutman. We can go on. No Tom Finney. You know, some big names. But not just that, no England 66. And then when you get into the 70s, what else is missing? The next generation haven't got those role models and those heroes, or it's been suppressed in some way. So the next generation, the Colin Bells, the George Bests, the men who entertained us in the 70s and 80s, and Glenn Hoddle, all these people, they had no role model. They would have had no role models. So that's what happened. Anyway, I'll explain more about the ban as we go along. But reaction to ban, I find this interesting. So I think there's a bit of a north-south divide, which I still need to unpick, because some of the northern professional men's teams were making a bit of money out of women's football, I think, by hiring out the stadiums. We'll get onto that another, perhaps next year or the year after, but we'll get onto that at some point. But with the southern-based teams, quite a lot of the women's teams were playing on grounds that were not FA affiliated anyway. So colleges, sort of female sports colleges, that sort of thing. Tottenham and Arsenal, the report on the left, their managers were completely against women playing football. So you'll see him there if you can read it. One of the lines from the Arsenal manager, future duties as mothers would be seriously impaired. Now, even if it was true, Even if, I mean, it could have easily been disproved this. You could have got medical experts to prove that women could play football and it wouldn't be harmful to health. But even if it was true, it should be their choice, not the manager of Arsenal. It should be their choice. You know, people take part in boxing. I might not think that's a particularly safe sport, but they do. I can't stop them, and I'm not going to. Why should I? So, lots still to unpick on the north-south bit, but also let's try and find out what every single professional male club, how they reacted. Obviously, attitudes change and so on. So was a Manchester... Now, I've used Manchester here. I should have used Trafford. Was a Trafford match to blame for the ban? The game at Old Trafford that got 30-odd thousand, in some of the local newspapers, is suggested that's the one that sort of, because of the crowd at Old Trafford, which was 30-odd thousand, but because of some of the things that happened around it. Now, again, lots, we're still at the beginning, lots to unpick, but it's an intriguing aspect to it. So the ban lasted, well, till 1970, but in effect, 71. Officials of men's clubs could not be involved. Right? So women's football did continue. It did not stop. It did continue, but it's severely restricted. How did they carry on? How did they react? So, a ladies' football association was established in England in December 1921. They created a cup competition. 60 clubs met in December 21 to talk about this. So, this is not every club went, but 60 clubs. This is significant. The original entrance of the women's ladies, FA Cup as it was called, included Rochdale locally, a team called Manchester United. They stopped being referred to as Manchester United after the first report. That may have been because of this idea that men's clubs couldn't be associated. It may have been a typing error in the very first one. We don't know. Again, more to unpick. What matters is it's a team from Manchester. A team from Stoke eventually won the competition in 1922, but it couldn't really be sustained. And I need to talk to Gail Newsham about this in more detail. But there's also the Dick Kerr's view of this competition. Everything it needs to be unpicked a little bit as well. But basically, the momentum of the competition, the momentum of the Ladies Football Association could not be maintained. And I've jumped forward to 1950. I'll jump back in a minute. But this is an example. So people say, did anyone get punished for coaching a women's team? Well, in 1950, Jimmy Broad Jr., who was an ex-Manchester City player, tried to set up a girls' team, a women's team at Cheltenham. And he was an official at Cheltenham. And so he was threatened with a ban, and he was banned from coaching a women's team. He managed to keep his job. But that's 1950. This is not 1921. This is 1950. How many others? We don't know. Sorry, my page is just stuck together. Okay. So as I said, some teams did play on, but it was difficult. Dick Kerr ladies from Preston, they certainly played on. They received some good coverage. They did an awful lot to promote the game. But in general, women's football was perhaps a little bit back to the days when we would only find out something had happened if there's a report in a newspaper of maybe some other activity. So maybe a charity, maybe a team coming over from Belgium, maybe football shirts or whatever it may be. Those kind of comments, if you like. So Dick Kerr's did get some good coverage, and there's some film of Dick Kerr's, but beyond that, any young girl wanting to play football did not have those role models around her. It was excluded. In Trafford, games were played occasionally. Dick Kerr's played a Belgian team in 1939 at White City, another stadium that unfortunately has gone in the Greater Manchester area, but a prominent sports venue for many, many decades. And there were other Manchester-related games. So you can see the bottom two refer to a fundraiser for Manchester Royal Infirmary. So there's games that are involved. There are games that are involved or connected with Manchester in some way. But overall, a structure was not in place. And then it starts getting exciting again in terms of people start to say, Sodom, we'll play anyway. So after World War II, well, first of all, in World War II, there's no massive growth in women's football through munitions factories as far as we can tell. But after World War II, the game did develop significantly. Games occurred at the Stretford Pageant each year, which, yes, it's a carnival, but it had a big sporting aspect to it. And the games were played in a stadium, not a FA-affiliated stadium, but in a stadium. So, that's significant. And in 1946, a team called Manchester Ladies, as far as we can tell, there's no direct connection with the earlier Manchester Ladies from pre-war, but Manchester Ladies was established by Marion Bindotti. And this is currently believed to be the first proper Manchester team of the post-war era. They were from Wythenshawe, big council estate at the time, and, very much Manchester, if you like, in outlook and views and so on. And like Dick Kerrs, they played in charity games and promoted the sport extensively. In 1946, the team was described as Manchester's only female football team. But, they continued to promote football. They played games in Trafford. And the Bindotti family tried to promote football where they could. So in the report on the bottom right, it's talking about Burnley. And I think it's Marion Bindotti's brother, Thomas Bindotti, is basically trying to encourage women in Burnley to get involved in football and offering to help. So it's fair to say that the Manchester Ladies were a pioneering team. Research by Steve Bolton, who's actually in the audience, shows that Manchester Ladies continued to play up to 1959. I will say that Steve's been performing some significant research into Manchester Ladies and really trying to get to grips with what this club is, and there's some really good stuff coming out of his work, so try and seek it out. And then in 1949, Manchester's next prominent team appeared, Manchester Corinthians. By the end of the 1950s, they had been on tours to Portugal, Holland, and other locations. In Holland, during 1958, they appeared in the Dutch newspapers as Manchester United at times. And I think that was connected with the Munich air crash and what had happened, and so on. Also, in some ways, probably good publicity at the time, because people knew Manchester United as a football team, and here's the Manchester United women's team. But it was definitely, well, I wasn't say definitely. It looks like it was Manchester Corinthians based on their tours and so on. But I don't read Dutch, so I'm still struggling with some of that. Manchester Corinthians established a second team, the Nomads, in 1957. Those names are really important because Percy Ashley, who created the Corinthians, as far as we can tell, he chose the name Corinthians because it represented all that was good about sport. Football, if you like. There'd been a famous men's amateur team called Corinthians. There'd also been a famous Manchester-based men's team called the Northern Nomads. And they were basically the northern version of the Corinthians, if you like, in terms of men's football. So I think he knew that those names was supposed to represent all that was good about football and promoting football and so on. So I think that was very deliberate. And, he managed to get famous footballers from the region involved at times. Manchester United's Johnny Carey did quite a few things early on. Bert Troutman went on tour with them and acted as an ambassador. So I think this is really, really significant. And the Corinthians, they toured across Europe, South America, and so on. In the late 1950s, before UEFA took any kind of interest in women's football, they won a major European trophy in Germany. It's actually the big trophy. It's that one, which also appears there. And that is significant, but of course, it's the days when UEFA didn't really sort of recognise women's football. But the fact that they did this, the fact that they went to Germany and participated in that. And then in 1960, they did something bigger. They went to South America and competed in what was described in the sort of Spanish language press in South America and Uruguay as like a Women's World Cup. I can't give the translation, but believe me, it is. And the Corinthians won that. And they played in front of 60,000 at one of the games. They were taken to the President's Palace in Uruguay. Margaret Whitworth, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but Margaret Whitworth went there as a young girl, 14 I think she was when she went over there. She got a marriage proposal from a fan. They were being mobbed wherever they went, And they were treated like major celebrities. There will be film of them. I'm desperate to find it. Film in South America. I want to do that. But that was described as a Women's World Cup, and they represented England. I won't get into all the official, unofficial World Cup things, but it's, they're a team. They're a team that played in South America and represented Manchester football and women superbly. The Corinthians were regulars in Trafford, and we are going to hear more about the Corinthians in the second half, including the Reims Trophy in 1970, which included, they beat Juventus in the final, and Juventus were a significant women's team. They're a significant men's professional team, but Italy was ahead of England in terms of its women's football as well, and that was a major achievement, and we're fortunate that we've got one of the winning players with us today, so we'll chat to her in the second half. In general, during the 1960s, football clubs across the region and across the country grew. There was an annual tournament down at Deal, which eventually evolved, it led to the formation of the Women's FA and the Women's FA Cup. And the Corinthians used to go to that and compete in that. And that was the real test, I suppose, because on a regular basis, you wouldn't be playing beyond your sort of region, really, although the Corinthians certainly did. But this was a great opportunity for teams to get together and judge how good they were and add that competitive element. Women's Football Association was established in 1969. Just to let you know, the FA have still, at this point, officially banned women from playing football on FA-affiliated grounds. So just to let you know about that. Gladys Aiken, who was a key figure behind the Corinthians at this time, she was on the Women's Football Association committee, and then, of course, the competition started. So the ban was lifted in 1970. Well, I want you to read that, if you can, that top. There's a little bit of a top cutting. If you go down to sort of the second paragraph, Mr. G. Evans, brackets English schools, spoke against the decision and said that he would not like to see ladies' football introduced. That's 1969. So if you went to school, if you're a woman who went to school in the 1960s or the 1970s and wanted to play football, he's the guy who's representing your wishes. So I don't know anything about him. So if you're watching, Mr. Evans, apologies. But it starts at the beginning. It starts at the beginning. So if girls can't play football at school because Mr. Evans doesn't like to see it, it's a problem, isn't it? So that was 1969, and so the phraseology of the FA minutes is such that it's up to regional associations. Then the next cut-in is women. The ban's lifted. The ban's lifted. Fine. Then UEFA in 1971 basically encouraged all nations to give women's football equal billing. But it takes a bit of time, doesn't it? And like I said before, you can reintroduce something, but it takes some time. I mean, look at COVID. It takes some time for things to get back to a normality. So now I'm going to talk a bit more for the next sort of 10 minutes, really, about 70s, 80s, 90s, and more recent areas. So this is living memory. This is not, again, 1921. This is living memory. So the ban is over. Yeah. And using Trafford as an example, there are lots of mentions in the local papers of women's football. It's not regular coverage, though. There may have been regular leagues taking part, and there were in the Northwest during the 70s quite a few regular leagues, but it's not getting the coverage. And then every so often you find something like this, and I loved this when I found it. So, when the archive staff at Trafford showed it to me, and then I found the picture at the top. This is the Sale Hotel. It's a pub. It used to be. It's still a pub, but it's not called that anymore. But it's a pub in Sale in Trafford. The guy on the end here is Joe Corrigan, the Manchester City men's goalkeeper, went on to play for England as well. Joe acted as coach for this team, who seemed to be wearing the Manchester City colours, actually. But this is, Sale Hotel. When you first see a cutting like that, you don't know if this team had a long life, if it was just a one-off or what. So that could have been, they'd been put together for a game. So I spoke to Joe, I phoned him up, and he said that he didn't manage to stay involved for long, but the landlord of the pub and the landlady of the pub, who I think is one of the players, decided to create a women's team to do a charity thing, and then they sort of played other games. But Joe didn't know too much, so I'm desperately trying to find one of these women. So if you know anyone who used to drink in the Sale Hotel, point in my direction. But then I found this other picture, and this is the killer for me. If you can read that bag, Sale Hotel Ladies Football Team, specially printed. The club badge seems to be a beer barrel and a knife and fork, but Sale Hotel Ladies Football Club. If you've got a bag printed, it's not one game, is it? It's games or ambition to play games. So if any of you know Liz Watson, San Diego, anybody else connect with Sale Hotel, obviously this is 50 years ago, I want to talk to them. Some of these women I know were sort of early 20s, maybe teens even, but some were early 20s. So some of them will be around. Looking at Trafford, there were staff teams. There's a lot of factories in Trafford, as I've said before, Trafford Park in particular. Manchester United, some of the women who worked in the Development Association and hospitality created a team back in 1972. So that picture is of them supposedly signing up players. One's in a kit and one's taking the names. But that, it's staged, it was a publicity thing. But they set up a staff team. There were staff teams at various factories. So these are only an example. I love the name of the Kellogg's factory. The Corn Crackers. Those women were the Kellogg's Corn Crackers. And these teams appeared a few times in local papers, but not mentioned that often. Occasionally photographed, not mentioned. They may have been one-off games. They may have been extensive, regular games. Who knows? But if you know anything about the factories of sort of Trafford Park and so on, you know that some of them had some pretty impressive sports facilities, and they had some pretty impressive activities for men and women. So I'd like to think some of these teams lasted a while. Unfortunately, a lot of the coverage does have sexist tones. I don't know if you can read that, but one of the prettiest soccer teams around, although their football was not stunning, they attracted plenty of interest. This tends to be the general theme, unfortunately, that, no matter what, these women have set up a team, they're playing, sometimes they play against men, but they set up a team, and then, their prettiest team, Unfortunately, there's probably still some people in football who probably talk in those sort of terms. But anyway, I'm showing you this because I want to give this message of how much football was taking place in the 70s, but we don't necessarily know the extent of it. We know these are clues. So I just picked 1977. I went through a newspaper called the Stretford Journal. There's a bound volume in the archives at Sale. I just started flicking through, and this picture appeared. Hot Shot Sue, a girl who made history locally because she played in what was perceived as the boys' team. All right? So that's 1977, but it's a story because a girl's playing in the boys' team. Well, I don't know if Mr. Evans knew about this. He'd have probably stopped it, but that for me is significant. And this is just Trafford. What's happening in Altrincham is part of Trafford. What's happening in Audenshaw? What's happening in Hyde? What's happening in Denton? This is significant for me. As well as that, female referee. What would Charlton say? That's not Charlton Athletic. It's Bobby Charlton, and I think he made some comments that perhaps he wouldn't make today about women in football. But she was a referee. She got involved in refereeing, and then she was refereeing in, I think it was called the Polish Working Men's League in the sort of Trafford area. The name isn't quite covered in the article properly, but her ambition was to referee at the highest level possible. This is a successful, it's a five-a-side team. He didn't play. It's a five-a-side team. He's the manager. One of the players couldn't make it, unfortunately, when we had the picture taken. But this is a girls' team that took part in a girls' five-a-side tournament in Manchester. So these are happening. These are just, like I say, grab a newspaper and there's odd mention. But there's not that coverage that the men's football was getting. So 1980s, the Women's FA moved to the Corn Exchange, just here, in an office. The PFA helped them. The PFA helped them. That's where some of the football in the community scheme started to develop. Some of the people from the PFA were meeting with Linda Whitehead from the Women's FA, and gradually it was like, well, we could perhaps fund women's teams through the football in the community scheme, and certainly Manchester City were one of the pilot community football in the community scheme. So were Oldham Athletic, and they were also two clubs that developed women's teams. But the 1980s saw regional leagues develop and grow. Various other football clubs developed. The Manchester United Supporters Club, which we're going to talk a bit more about in a few minutes. Teams like FC Red Star, Ermston, these teams started to develop. And there were multiple regional leagues in the area, and multiple teams across Trafford, across Manchester, across Greater Manchester. And then the late 1980s, that football in the community scheme that I talked about sort of encouraged some professional men's clubs to begin developing women's teams, and that's sort of Manchester City squad picture at the top, Manchester City ladies as we call it at the time. But the 1980s were significant locally for a number of reasons. In 1989, the Women's FA Cup final was played at Old Trafford, the only Women's FA Cup final to be played in Greater Manchester. Yeah, I can still say Greater Manchester. Leeso Pacific, who were a major team on Merseyside, they reached the final in 88. They won the FA Cup in 1989. I've got stories from one of the women who played in that 1989 final, was captured as part of the Trafford project, Trafford element of the Women's Euros project. And it's really poignant because it also coincided with the Hillsborough disaster, which had occurred the week before. And 3 of the women, including one I interviewed, was at Hillsborough on the Leppington Lane end on the day of the Hillsborough disaster. And in the week between then and the Women's FA Cup final, there was a whole series of debates. Do we play on? Does the game take place? Does it happen? And they took the decision to play on. Friends of Fulham, the other cup final team, were saying it's up to you. We understand, but the game did play, and Leeso won, which, and the players like Hope Powell, I think, was in the Friends of Fulham team. Anyway, go on the Trafford Heritage website and you'll find out the story of that. But it was certainly an emotional and difficult time. So, I can't go into all the details now, but several prominent teams developed across the region. From a Trafford perspective, Trafford Ladies, and again, I've interviewed a woman who was involved with Trafford Ladies, started life in 1991 as Surrey United. They actually got trounced by the Manchester City team, 11-0 in their first season. But within a couple of years, they were playing in a higher division than Manchester City and Manchester United's women's teams. So they developed. And Trafford Ladies, up until this project, I bet very few people had ever heard of them, to be frank, unless you played for them or played against them. And now, for me, this is a story. This is the sort of thing. You can see the sort of progression. Division 4 fair play winners, and then it goes on and on and on. Division 2 runners up, and then they're playing, highest level possible. And of course, nationally, there's the Women's Super League was launched, and by 2016, there's all sorts of stuff. So, I'll briefly mention City and United because obviously, when people talk about the Manchester conurbation, Manchester City men's team, Manchester United men's team dominate, and now we've got Manchester City women's team and Manchester United women's team in the Women's Super League. So a bit of background, which often gets forgotten, but United started as a supporters club team in October 77, and again, one of the people who, she's not arrived yet, but one of the people who's going to be on the panel in the second half was a member of the Manchester United team in the 70s and early 80s. So we'll ask Jane about that. But it was it was a club that developed. They played. They helped create a league. They helped to create the Greater Manchester Women's Football League, and they, as a group of women striving to develop football, they were pretty important, pretty significant. Manchester United became formally affiliated to Manchester United in 1990, and then a formal partnership in 2001. And unfortunately, and we won't go into the politics of this at the moment, but they were disbanded in 2005. But United now is another team that was re-established in 2018. And I think the legacy of those women has to play a part in what football clubs do today. So that's important. Manchester City started as a club initiative, football in the community, in October 1988. They played friendlies throughout that first season. They joined the North West Women's Regional Football League, if you're wondering what all those letters are. It's the North West Women's Regional Football League, Division 2 in 1989, where a team called Red Star, which we'll talk about in the second half, but Red Star were already in that league, and they were promoted in 1991. They had a crucial make-or-break moment in 1996 when the squad was down to small numbers and there was decisions, do we carry on or whatever. But from then on, they grew. And it's really interesting. This morning, if you were here for Kerry Dunn's talk, we heard how some men's teams, professional men's teams, when they hit financial difficulties, the women's team goes. At City, from 1996 to 2003, the women's team was by far more successful than the men's team and was probably the most positive aspect of the club. The club went on this roller coaster existence, the men's club, dropping to its lowest ever level. But the women's team carried on through those difficulties. It didn't stop. Down to the women who were involved in that, not down to the parent club, down to the women involved. And that club carried on. And that club has an unbroken line all the way through to the current Manchester City women. Anyway, we've got people talk about this in the second half. We've got Leslie, who played for City, coming up in the second half. So, for me, I'm conscious of time. It's 45 minutes. But a brief reminder, this project has been trying to capture the stories of ordinary women who contributed to the development of women's football. It would have been very easy in some ways to just go for the famous footballers and say, tell us your story. But we wanted to capture the stories of everyday women's footballers and hear their stories, because in some ways they're much more interesting. The women who, against all the odds, carried on and carried on and carried on. And for me, it's these stories that are more important in some ways. What I will say is, it's so important that if you played or know somebody who played for a team in Trafford or Manchester, because the National Football Museum are doing the same for Manchester, and every other host city is doing the same for those host cities. So if you're from Sheffield or Leigh and Wigan, talk to them. But if you played for a team in your area, or you come from that area, if you come from Trafford or Manchester, then talk to us. We want to capture those views. It may not be me, I'm focusing on Trafford, but, we're interested in those stories. We want to capture them for future generations. That's the beauty of this project. So each host city has a similar project, so contact your local project if you want to help. And like I say, the National Football Museum is the lead for the City of Manchester. Right, I need some water. It's time for a break. We're going to have a 10, 15-minute break, and then we're going to have the panel discussion in the second half. So come back for 3 o'clock-ish, and we'll crack on. Thank you.